December 23, 1944. The air hung thick and frigid, a biting shroud across the snow-covered forests surrounding Bastogne, Belgium. This was no ordinary winter's day. It was the crucible of the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate German offensive that had caught the Allied forces off guard. For days, the vaunted 101st Airborne Division had been besieged, encircled by overwhelming enemy forces, their lines bending but not breaking. Their resilience was legendary, their spirit unbroken, but courage alone could not forge bullets or conjure artillery shells. The very survival of these brave men hinged on one increasingly scarce commodity: ammunition. The freezing wind whipped through the trees, carrying the distinct scent of cordite and despair. German artillery pounded the perimeter ceaselessly, each explosion echoing the grim reality of their situation. Inside the defensive ring, Major Alistair Thompson, his face grimed with soot and worry, clutched a field telephone. His voice was hoarse, a desperate plea directed at an unseen quartermaster officer miles away. "We're down to less than 10 rounds per gun on the 105s, Captain. Small arms are critically low too. My men are fighting with bayonets and bravado, but that won't stop a Panther tank forever." He slammed the receiver down, the metallic clang a stark counterpoint to the distant roar of battle. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, along with other elements of the 101st, were facing relentless counterattacks. Every man knew what it meant to run dry. It meant certain annihilation. Miles behind the beleaguered perimeter, in a dimly lit makeshift supply depot carved out of a bombed-out barn, Private First Class Arthur "Art" Jenkins of the 345th Quartermaster Truck Company listened intently. He was a quiet man, barely 22, with sharp, observant eyes that missed little. His hands, though calloused from years of working on farms and engines back in rural Ohio, possessed a surprising delicacy when it came to coaxing a temperamental GMC CCKW-2 1 to 2-ton truck through impossible conditions. Art was a driver, one of the unsung heroes of the supply lines, whose daily grind of dodging bombs and bullets to deliver beans and bullets was often overlooked. He'd just finished a harrowing run, navigating shell-cratered roads, his truck's windshield wipers battling the relentless snow as much as the threat of enemy patrols. He knew the roads around Bastogne like the back of his hand, and he knew they were all but impassable now. Captain Davies, the quartermaster officer, paced the dusty floor, his face etched with the weight of impossible decisions. "The weather's grounded the C-47s again," he announced, his voice heavy. "And the conventional routes. Well, you all know the stories. Another convoy lost on the N8 this morning, ambushed near Foy. The N30 is heavily contested, too many roadblocks and German patrols. It's a meat grinder out there." A low murmur went through the small gathering of drivers and mechanics. Every man understood the gravity of the situation. Getting a truckload of ammunition into Bastogne was no longer a dangerous mission. It was a suicide run. Yet without it, the paratroopers would be wiped out. It seemed utterly impossible, a mission doomed to fail before it even began. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This historical account isn't just about a supply run, it's about how desperation breeds ingenuity, and how one man's unconventional thinking, born from a lifetime of observation and an almost preternatural connection to the land and its forgotten paths, could turn the tide of a seemingly lost cause. It's a story of transformation, of a quiet driver revealing a depth of courage and resourcefulness that would save thousands of lives, a testament to the fact that even in the chaos of war, the most unlikely heroes can emerge from the shadows. Major Thompson's calls grew more frantic as the hours crawled by. The shelling on the perimeter intensified, an almost unbroken roar that shook the frozen earth. His men, particularly those of the 2nd Battalion, 506th PIR, were facing relentless assaults. The 105mm howitzers of the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, usually their protective shield, had fallen silent, their ammunition chests empty. German panzers were pushing closer, emboldened by the lack of counterfire. "We need rounds." "Captain, any rounds?" Thompson screamed into the phone, his voice ragged. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear for himself, but from the terrifying knowledge that his soldiers, His boys were staring down an impossible fight. He looked out at the faces of his men, grim, exhausted, but still defiant. How much longer could defiance last without bullets? Back at the depot, Captain Davies slumped onto a stack of empty crates. He had exhausted every official channel, every standard procedure. The situation was dire. The command structure was trying everything, but the German encirclement was complete, and the weather was an enemy as formidable as the Wehrmacht. He was about to give the order to simply hold their positions and pray for an airdrop miracle that wasn't coming, when a quiet voice cut through the despair. "Captain, sir," Art Jenkins began, stepping forward. His voice was calm, almost detached, a stark contrast to the panic gripping the depot. There might be another way. Davies looked up, skepticism warring with a flicker of desperate hope. "Another way, Private? What are you talking about? Every road, every trail, every goat path is either blocked, ambushed, or underwater." "Not this one, sir," Art replied, unrolling a tattered, outdated map he'd picked up from a Belgian farmer weeks ago. It was hand-drawn, showing local logging trails and hunting paths, details that rarely made it onto official military charts. He pointed to a faint, barely visible line snaking through a dense section of the Ardennes, far to the west of the known combat zones, then turning sharply eastward. "This here," he traced the line with a grimy finger, "is an old logging path. Goes through the Bois Jacques, past a few old homesteads, then cuts south of Neuville before swinging back towards the perimeter. It's not on the current military maps because it hasn't been used in years, not since the lumber company went bust in '39. Captain Davies peered closer, his brow furrowed. "A logging path. Jenkins, those things are barely wide enough for a jeep in peacetime, let alone a 2.5-ton truck loaded with heavy artillery shells. And with this snow, it's probably impassable. Likely mined, too, if the Germans even bothered to scout it. It's steep in places, sir, and probably got fallen trees, but it avoids the known ambush points on the N8, and it's far from the troop concentrations on the N30. It's rough, yes, but it's hidden. It's a gamble, I know, but it's a gamble we might have to take." Art's eyes met his captain's, a flicker of conviction burning within them. "I drove a timber truck for a season before the war. I know what these old trails are like, and I know this truck. It can do it." Davies considered this. It was an insane proposition, a wild goose chase through uncharted, enemy-infested territory. But what were the alternatives? Watch Bastogne fall? Let the 101st be overrun? "Insane," Davies muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Absolutely insane, but you might be right, Jenkins. Desperate times, I suppose." He paused, then made his decision. "All right, Private, you've got your truck. Load it up with everything we've got. 105mm shells first, then 50 cal, then 30 cal. Make sure it's secure. And you'll need a guard. Sergeant Miller, get over here." Sergeant Frank Miller, a wiry, no-nonsense infantryman who'd been temporarily assigned to the quartermaster detachment after his unit took heavy casualties, sauntered over. He looked Art up and down, a skeptical glint in his eyes. "A logging path. You serious, Captain? We're sending a truck full of ammunition down a deer trail. What are we, pioneers now?" "It's our best shot, Sergeant," Davies stated, his voice firm. "Jenkins here thinks he can do it. Your job is to keep an eye out for anything that moves and make sure he gets through." Miller sighed, adjusting his M1 Garand. "Just my luck. From fighting Krauts to babysitting a supply driver on a joyride. All right, Jenkins, let's see what kind of magic you've got up your sleeve." His tone was dismissive, but there was an underlying weariness that spoke of weeks of constant combat. He had seen too many good men die for lack of a single bullet. Within the hour, Art's GMC CCKW, affectionately known as a deuce and a half for its carrying capacity, was meticulously loaded. 6 heavy crates of 105mm high-explosive shells were secured first, each weighing close to 100 pounds. Then came the ammunition for the heavy machine guns, 12 metal containers of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds, followed by 20 boxes of 30 caliber ball ammunition for the M1 Garands and Browning automatic rifles. The weight was considerable, pushing the truck to its limits, but every round was precious. Each shell, each bullet represented a life that could be saved, a German assault that could be repelled. Art checked the tire pressure, the oil, the fuel, his movements precise and deliberate. This wasn't just a truck, it was the lifeline for Bastogne. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, plunging the snow-laden landscape into an inky blackness, when Art and Sergeant Miller finally set off. The engine roared to life, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to challenge the stillness of the night. The exhaust plumed out in thick white clouds, quickly dissipating into the freezing air. Art gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The initial stretch of road was known, a partially cleared track leading away from the depot. But soon Art swung the truck sharply to the right, leaving the relative safety of the main route behind. The tires crunched over untouched snow, the silence of the forest broken only by the straining engine. "This is it, Miller," Art said, his voice low. "The shortcut." Miller peered out into the darkness, his breath misting in the cold cab. "Looks more like a deer path than a road, Art. You sure about this?" "As sure as I can be," Art replied, his eyes scanning the barely discernible path ahead, illuminated only by the truck's dim headlights. The beam cut through the thick fog and falling snow, revealing a narrow tunnel of trees, their branches heavy with white. The path was indeed a mere track, barely wider than the truck itself, forcing Art to guide the heavy vehicle with absolute precision. Branches scraped against the truck's canvas cover, sounding like skeletal fingers dragging across a blackboard. The terrain quickly became treacherous. Deep snowdrifts, some nearly a meter high, challenged the truck's momentum. Art had to maintain a steady speed, sometimes rocking the truck back and forth to break through the packed snow. The ruts, frozen solid beneath the fresh powder, bucked the vehicle violently, threatening to throw it off course. Miller, initially jaded, found himself gripping the grab handle, his eyes darting through the trees, alert for any sign of danger that wasn't just natural terrain. They encountered their first major obstacle within the first hour. A massive oak, felled by a recent storm, lay squarely across the path, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. "Damn it all," Miller cursed, drawing his M1. "Looks like we're turning back, Art. No way this tub gets over that." Art killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening, broken only by the creak of settling snow and the distant muffled thud of artillery. He grabbed his axe from behind the seat. "We're not turning back, Sergeant. We go through. Help me clear these smaller branches, then we'll try to winch the main trunk out of the way." It was a laborious process in the freezing cold, their breath fogging in the headlight beams. Art used the truck's winch, a heavy steel cable groaning under the strain, to slowly drag the thick trunk aside millimeter by painful millimeter. Sweat plastered his hair to his forehead. Despite the sub-zero temperatures, it took them nearly an hour, precious time lost, but the path was eventually cleared. As they pressed on, the path became steeper, winding uphill through a dense section of pines. The gradient, combined with the ice and snow, made every foot a struggle. The engine whined, straining, and the tires spun, throwing up gouts of snow. Art expertly feathered the throttle, feeling the grip, easing off when it started to spin, then pushing again. He drove with a surgeon's touch, coaxing the powerful yet unwieldy truck forward. Miller watched, mesmerized by the driver's intimate knowledge of his machine, a respect slowly beginning to replace his initial skepticism. Then came the shocking revelation. As they rounded a particularly sharp bend, the headlights cut through the gloom, momentarily illuminating something that sent a jolt of fear through both men. Just off the path, partially obscured by heavy snowdrifts and fallen branches, was a recently abandoned German field outpost. There were remnants of a campfire still smoking faintly, and discarded ration tins, empty ammunition crates, and the distinct muddy tracks of German half-tracks. This was no forgotten trail. The enemy was using it, or at least had been. The insane shortcut wasn't just physically arduous, it was a live wire, potentially teeming with hostile patrols. "Holy hell, Art," Miller whispered, his voice tight, his rifle instinctively raising. "They're here. They've been using this path." Art's heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady on the wheel. "Looks like it, Miller," he said, forcing a calm he didn't entirely feel. "Or they were very recently. Might be a scout patrol or a staging point for an attack." He killed the headlights, plunging them into near-total darkness, relying on the faint moonlight filtering through the broken cloud cover. He eased the truck forward, moving agonizingly slowly, the engine barely a whisper. The danger was no longer abstract. It was immediate, palpable. The shortcut was a trap waiting to spring. They were now deep behind enemy lines, and discovery meant not just failure, but certain death. They crept through the dark, their senses heightened. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sounded like an approaching enemy. Miller scanned the darkness, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, his eyes straining. They narrowly avoided another, even more critical close call. As they navigated a particularly narrow defile, a faint, rhythmic, crunching sound reached their ears from up ahead. It was the distinct sound of men marching in formation through snow. German voices, hushed but discernible, carried on the frigid air. Art slammed on the brakes, cutting the engine immediately. The sudden silence was absolute, suffocating. He and Miller pressed themselves against the cab's interior, barely daring to breathe. The marching sounds grew closer, then passed within an agonizingly close distance just a few meters beyond the dense screen of pines that bordered the path. They could hear the creak of leather, the metallic jingle of equipment, the low German chatter. It was a small patrol, perhaps a dozen men, but enough to destroy them. It felt like an eternity before the sounds faded into the distance. "That was too damn close, Art," Miller breathed, wiping a cold sweat from his brow. His tough exterior had cracked. Too damn close. A few more feet and we'd be Swiss cheese. "Yeah," Art agreed, his voice a strained whisper. He restarted the engine, its gentle hum sounding deafeningly loud in the aftermath. He had to be even more careful now. This shortcut wasn't just a physical challenge. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse. He realized the path wasn't safe because it was unknown. It was a corridor that the Germans themselves might be using for stealthy movements around the perimeter. His insight had been both a stroke of genius and a roll of the dice with fate. The truck continued its agonizingly slow crawl. Art's focus was absolute, his eyes burning, straining to see beyond the inadequate headlights, constantly adjusting to the ever-changing terrain. He knew every shudder of the engine, every groan of the suspension, every slip of the tires. He was one with the machine, coaxing it through seemingly impossible obstacles. They encountered stretches where the path simply vanished under deep, wind-blown snow, forcing Art to rely on instinct and the faint memory of a contour line on an old map. He drove by feel, sensing the slope of the land, the subtle changes in the texture of the snow that indicated solid ground versus a hidden ditch. The cold was relentless, seeping into their bones. The heater in the old truck was barely functional, and their breath plumed in front of their faces like tiny fog banks. Miller shivered, his hands tucked under his armpits, but his eyes never left the darkness outside. He'd seen enough combat to know that the next sound could be their last. He began to appreciate Art's calm resolve, his unwavering determination. This driver, this unassuming private, was performing miracles with a clunky truck and a forgotten path. Mid-journey, a fresh, unforeseen disaster struck. They were traversing a particularly narrow section of the trail, carved into the side of a steep, snow-laden slope. Without warning, a deep rumble vibrated through the truck and the ground ahead seemed to collapse. A section of the hillside, weakened by the constant freezing and thawing, had given way, sending a cascade of earth, rock, and snow thundering down into the path below. It wasn't just a few fallen trees this time. It was a substantial landslide, completely blocking the trail with an impassable wall of debris. Art slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding precariously close to the edge of the newly formed chasm. "No," he breathed, the single word laden with despair. This was it. This was the end of the line. Turning back was impossible on this narrow ledge. The entire section of the path was gone. Miller stared at the impassable wall of earth and snow, then down into the dark abyss where the path used to be. "Well, that's that," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, a grim acceptance of defeat. "Guess the Germans won't even have to find us." The mountain did their job, but Art wasn't ready to give up. He stared at the impossible obstacle, then slowly, his gaze drifted upwards, to the incredibly steep, almost vertical slope of the hill above them. It was a nightmare of snow-covered rock and frozen scrub brush, seemingly impossible for anything but a mountain goat. But then his eyes caught a subtle, almost imperceptible detail. A faint, narrow ledge, barely wide enough for a man, seemed to traverse the face of the cliff just above the landslide, eventually rejoining the path further on. It was an old game trail, perhaps, or a shepherd's shortcut from decades ago. No truck, especially one loaded to the gills, could possibly navigate that. It was madness. "Miller," Art said, his voice strangely calm. "We're going over that." Miller looked from Art to the sheer cliff face, then back to Art, disbelief etched on his face. "Over that? Are you out of your mind? We'll roll straight down the mountain, shells and all. We'll be smeared across the valley floor." "We have to try," Art insisted, his eyes blazing with a desperate resolve. "Bastogne is waiting. Those men are waiting. There's no other way through and no way back. I think I can make it." He began to reverse the truck, slowly, carefully, until the front end was pointed directly at the daunting slope. He was going to attempt to drive up the vertical face, then attempt to traverse the impossibly narrow ledge. It defied every law of physics and common sense. It was the apex of his insane shortcut. Art engaged the truck's low-range gears, shifting the transmission with a practiced hand. He could feel the engine laboring, fighting for traction. He aimed the front wheels at the steepest yet most stable-looking part of the slope. "Hold on tight, Sergeant," he yelled, and then he floored the accelerator. The deuce and a half roared, its tires digging into the snow, clawing for purchase. The front end of the truck lifted, the vehicle tilting at a terrifying angle. Loose rocks and snow cascaded down around them as the truck fought its way upwards. Miller screamed, part in fear, part in awe, as he clung to the dashboard, convinced this was their final, glorious, suicidal act. The cargo of shells clanged and shifted precariously in the back. The truck bucked and slid, threatening to roll at any moment, but Art, with an almost supernatural touch, kept it balanced, correcting every wobble, every slide. He drove with an animal instinct, his movements fluid and precise, as if the truck was an extension of his own body. Slowly, painstakingly, they gained elevation. Finally, with a gut-wrenching lurch, the front wheels found purchase on the narrow ledge. Art then began the agonizing crawl along the precipice, the sheer drop mere inches from their tires. One wrong move, one slip, and it was over. The journey along the ledge felt like an eternity, every inch a monumental effort against gravity and the terrifying emptiness below. But Art, fueled by sheer will and the image of desperate soldiers, pushed through. He was no longer just a driver. He was a lifeline, a desperate hope navigating the precipice of doom. After what felt like an hour, but was likely only 15 minutes of heart-stopping terror, they finally pulled off the ledge and back onto what remained of the trail, albeit on a higher, safer section beyond the landslide. Both men were shaking, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Miller slumped in his seat, breathless. "Art," he croaked, I don't know what to say. You're insane. But you did it. How in the hell did you do that?" "Just keep driving, Sergeant," Art replied, his voice still strained, but a flicker of grim satisfaction in his eyes. He checked his watch. They had lost more time than they could afford, but they were still moving, still pushing towards Bastogne. The rest of the journey was a blur of relentless cold, harrowing turns, and constant vigilance. They had covered roughly 25 miles of treacherous terrain, averaging a mere 4 to 5 miles per hour. The truck was battered, scarred, its canvas ripped, its engine coughing, but it was still running. Art drove through sheer exhaustion, his eyes burning, his muscles screaming. He kept thinking of Major Thompson's voice, the desperation of the men waiting for him. He imagined the quiet bravery of the paratroopers, holding the line, freezing, hungry, and now almost out of bullets. That thought kept him going. As dawn approached, a faint metallic scent began to mingle with the cold pine air, the unmistakable smell of battle. They were getting close. The distant thud of artillery grew louder, more insistent. Art pushed the truck faster, the old engine roaring in protest but responding to his desperate will. The path, though still rough, gradually widened, showing signs of more recent, though limited, traffic. They had almost made it through the insane shortcut. Inside the perimeter of Bastogne, Major Thompson had given the order for his men to prepare for a final, desperate stand. Artillery silence had meant German forces had pushed closer, their tanks now visible on the horizon. The remaining 105mm shells had been fired in a last, defiant volley. Small arms fire was sporadic, conserving precious rounds. Hope was a fragile thing, almost extinguished by the relentless German pressure. Sergeant Owens, an artilleryman, stood beside a silent 105mm howitzer, his face grim. "That's it, boys," he said, his voice flat. "No more." Suddenly, through the dense, snow-covered tree line on the western edge of the perimeter, a faint rumble became audible, a sound utterly out of place. It was too regular for distant artillery, too deep for a tank. It was the sound of a heavy truck. The men on the line exchanged disbelieving glances. It was impossible. No supply truck could have gotten through. Then, with a final desperate burst of speed, Private First Class Art Jenkins, his face smeared with grease and exhaustion, burst through the tree line. His battered, snow-covered GMC CCKW 212-ton truck, its headlights flickering, tires almost bald, came rumbling into the makeshift perimeter. It was a sight that brought tears to the eyes of battle-hardened men. The canvas cover was ripped, the body dented, but it was there, and it was loaded with ammunition. A wave of disbelief. Then an explosion of cheers erupted from the exhausted troops. "Ammo, it's ammo!" The cry went up, echoing through the lines. Major Thompson, witnessing the incredible sight, dropped his binoculars, a mixture of shock and profound relief washing over him. Sergeant Miller, jumping down from the passenger seat, his face beaming, yelled, "He did it! The crazy son of a gun did it!" Art Jenkins, his body aching, his mind reeling from the ordeal, simply sat in the driver's seat for a moment, letting the wave of sound wash over him. He had made it. He had brought the ammunition. The unloading was a frenzy of activity. Every available man, regardless of rank, threw themselves at the truck. The heavy crates of 105mm shells were manhandled out first, rushed to the waiting artillery pieces. Within minutes, the first thump whoosh of a 105mm howitzer broke the ominous silence, followed by another and another. The sound of American artillery roaring back to life was like a thunderclap to both sides. For the Germans, it was a demoralizing shock, signaling that the besieged paratroopers were far from broken. For the Allies, it was an elixir, a potent dose of hope and defiance. Small arms ammunition, 50 caliber rounds, 30 caliber cartridges were distributed with equal urgency, refilling empty pouches and magazines. The lines that had been on the verge of collapsing now solidified, infused with renewed firepower and morale. The German attack, which had been gaining terrifying momentum, faltered, then began to recede under the weight of the revived American fire. This single, seemingly impossible supply run, driven by one determined man's insane shortcut, had arrived just in time. It didn't win the Battle of the Bulge, but it provided the critical breathing room, the essential firepower that allowed the 101st Airborne to hold Bastogne through its darkest hours. It was a testament to the vital, often overlooked role of logistics and supply in modern warfare, a stark reminder that courage on the front lines is meaningless without the means to fight. The defense of Bastogne, a pivotal moment that broke the back of the German Ardennes offensive, was secured not just by paratroopers, but by the relentless, ingenious efforts of men like Art Jenkins. His extraordinary improvisation embodied the American spirit of ingenuity and refusal to accept defeat. After the siege was finally broken and the encirclement lifted, Private First Class Arthur Jenkins was officially commended for his extraordinary courage and resourcefulness. He received the Bronze Star for his actions, a quiet recognition for an act that saved countless lives. But like many unsung heroes of the war, he returned to a life of quiet anonymity. He never sought glory or fame. After the war, he went back to Ohio, eventually finding work as a long-haul truck driver, traversing the highways of a peacetime America. The rumble of a big rig was familiar, comforting, a far cry from the terrifying roar of his deuce and a half through the snow-bound forests of the Ardennes. The harrowing journey to Bastogne remained a vivid memory, a story he rarely spoke of, but one that lived on in the legends of the 345th Quartermaster Truck Company and among the veterans of the 101st Airborne who survived that brutal Christmas. The bitter cold of that December day, the desperate defense, the seemingly impossible mission. All of it once again comes to mind, but now it is not merely a memory of hardship, but one imbued with a profound sense of triumph. The impossible mission against all odds was achieved, not by grand strategy or sweeping offensives, but by the quiet grit of one American driver who dared to take an insane shortcut, delivering salvation when all hope seemed lost. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.